Okay, today, Tailey Fang face rig. We've got a bunch of controllers we got to talk about. We've got several for each eyebrow to move, the inside, the center, and the outside. We've got one controller for each eyelid, top and bottom. There's a controller underneath each eye that just lets you get some subtle expressions there. We've got one for the cheek in case you want to make the cheek bigger, smaller, move it around. One for the nose, which if you move, points down to her mouth. We have one major controller at the front of her mouth that everything in her mouth or her lips are attached to. Then we've got one inside of her mouth that one on the front points to and maintains a distance from. We've got a bunch of controllers, 5 on the top, 5 on the bottom for her lips. We've got one inside of her mouth here that her tongue points to, so you can move that around. It also does a little bit of, by her tongue pointing, I mean there's a bendy bone that has a stretch to and does some copy rotation and copy location constraints on there. There's a controller that her jaw points to in case you want her teeth closed but her lips open. We've got one controller for each eye to look at, and then those two controllers are a child of this one in the middle so that you can move both of them simultaneously. And I believe that's it for the controllers. A real quick overview of what they do. The controllers at the top and bottom of our lips just move, let's in this case say the bottom lip, and then there's two controllers kind of halfway between the bottom and the corner of her mouth that always roughly maintains a spot about halfway in between. And then the corners of her mouth you can move, and they also, again, when the corner of her mouth moves, there are these two in between that stay roughly halfway in between that and the centers of the top and bottom. The nose controller, as I mentioned earlier, points to the bottom of her mouth. That way when I move it right and left, the bottom of her nose still points kind of towards her mouth. The outside of her eyelids have controller that you don't ever use because they just have a track to this controller that you actually do use. That way her eyelid will move only on this one degree of freedom. That way it keeps it from looking crazy. You can't do as many fun things with it, but it never looks bad. We have these bones inside of her eyes that aren't really controllers. Those are what her eyes are attached to, and they are what then cause the eyes to look at this other thing. There's some bones in between her eyelids and her eyebrows that roughly stay halfway in between the two. That way that area between the eyelids and eyebrows doesn't get kind of crazy. And I think that is a real quick overview. I guess I should talk a little bit about ears. There's one major controller on the ears that you can move the entire ear around, and then another one at the bottom in case you want to just do the bottom, and another at the top in case you just want to do the top. That way you can make health ears, right? And that is a very fast overview of the face rig. So now let's go into some detail and figure out how this works, right? So let's start with the eyes. I feel like eyes are simple enough. We can get started. So as I mentioned, let's turn off the shapes so we can understand a little bit better what's going on. So this controller at the top you see is quite long, and the point of it is it needs to extend all the way out to here so that the bottom or the outside of her eyelid points directly at the end of this controller bone. And let's look at the constraint for that, right? So this eyelid here has a damped track to that eyelid top control. That way when I grab it and move it down, well then her eyelid moves down. When I move it up, her eyelid moves up. Now I have locked a bunch of things like the rotation and location of this thing so that it'll stay on a track and won't do too many wild and weird things. And that's just because I otherwise lose control of the eyelids and they get pretty unattractive. Bottom eyelid, same thing. It just points to this eyelid controller on the bottom. There is also this controller underneath her eye that follows along with the bottom eyelid when it moves. Now the eyebrows, the way I've implemented these, as you can see, is there's some bendy bones. I would definitely not recommend doing that. I'm not happy with the bendy bone setup at all. I think I'm just going to redo this eventually to be just like her mouth rig, which we're going to see here in a second. But while we're still up here at her eyes, I've got these eye attach bones. The eye attach bones are what her eyes are attached to. But notice that these have a damped track to the eye look, and so this is the eye look bone out here. So like when this moves, this bone damped track follows it. There is another bone in here that's similar. There, got it. This is called eyelid rotate with eye. And if you take a look at that, it copies the scale is not important really. Copies the location is not important really. What is important is it copies the rotation of this eye attached. So if I move her eye, let's take that left eye and move it around, you can see that the bone that her eye is attached to is moving quite a lot, but that shorter bone that has the same location also moves, but much less. And so the point of it moving less is her eyelid structure is a child of that. That way when I do move this bone, and I use this window to move it around, so when I do move this bone to move her eye, you see her eyelids also move a little bit at the same time. That's important to be more realistic. I'm much happier with the way that looks. So these also, these are just regular bones, I should say, that are in between the eyebrow and eyelid, and these have some copy location that will kind of keep it between, well, the way I have it set up is not that it's between these two, instead I have it that it follows I believe it's this one when I turn off the shapes, I don't know if it's the other one, this is the eyebrow. So as the eyebrows move, those bones that are between the eyebrows and the eyelids also move, as you can see, but they are really moving along with this. If I was to do this again, I would probably try forcing these to end up being part way between, say, this top middle bone of this top eyelid and the middle bone of the eyebrow. But that is the way I saw it at the time, so that's what we've got. So there is another bone here that I use for resizing the eye, but I don't use that very often. It's just in case you think it's a little bit too large or a little too small. Everything has a child of that in that area. So let's take a look at this nose bone. So the nose bone, as I mentioned earlier, it's got this damped track to the control mouth master, which is that yellow bone here that everything is a child of. So it's pointing at that all the time. That way, if I take her mouth and I move it to the right, well then the bottom of her nose kind of points that way. And I say kind of because the damped track is not with full influence. The other thing to pay attention to is this this controller that is, all of her lips are a child of. You can actually see these little parent relationship lines floating in between there. The other thing about this is I want it to have maintain its distance, and I never, on most of my constraints I don't do it full strength. Like this one, for example, is 0.8. So I want it to maintain the distance between it and that center of her mouth, but I can still pull it out a little bit or push it back if I want to. It doesn't maintain that distance completely, but it maintains a lot. So if I grab this bone right at the center of her mouth and move it, then it moves her mouth quite a bit, and too far is also possible. What this does allow me to do is I can take this from the default pose, and let's say I just give her a little bit of a smile, right? So here's the smile. Then I can take that bone in the bottom and I can like move it down a little bit, and suddenly it's not a smile, it's kind of a grimace. Or I can move it up and it's a kind of a goofy smile where the bottom lip is pulled up a little bit further than the top lip, right? So you can kind of get a little bit of interest by playing with that bone there. Now, the meta controllers out here do multiple things at once to the bones. So this meta controller, for example, when I size it on a Z-axis, it'll open her mouth. And so what that'll do is control this bone that her jaw points to, mouth open action, at the same time as her lips and a few other things. So this is the way I can open her mouth without moving her lips and her jaw. And now the trick with the meta controllers is generally you want these just driving action constraints. Now, as we're looking at things, you might notice that I'm using transforms and copy locations and copy rotations at times. I would really not recommend doing that. What I've learned is action constraints are way more interesting and powerful. Action constraints are sort of like shape keys for armatures. You can put your armature in one pose, put it in another pose, and then have the action constraint kind of blend between them, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second. So the controllers for her mouth, there are, let's say, there are four main ones. There's the top center, bottom center, and then the two mouth corners. So each one of the top center, each one of those four main controls, I guess I should say, have like these action constraints on them. So this way, if I move this on, say, its Z-axis, I go into a smile. And I believe this has been moved, yep. So if I move this on its Z-axis, I go into a smile. What does this mean? So what I did was I took her face and put her in the biggest, craziest, over bizarre smile I can think of, put that as one location, and then just a neutral face as another, and then I can blend between them by using an action constraint on this controller. Then I have another look, which is for grimacing. This is like the biggest grimace possible. Have that on this end of the action constraint. So this way I can do I don't know, various things. So one other one is like pursing her lips, and then they're just not a lot, or I guess like right and left. So I largely control the right and leftness of this rig by having when the meta controller moves right and left, this control in front of her mouth also moves right and left, or I can control it independently like this. You might want to use an action constraint for that so that you get like more proper facial expressions out of that. The bones in her cheeks, pretty much just a regular bone that I placed in her cheeks. I'm more happy with scaling it than I am with moving it. If you move it, it kind of can look a little bit silly. But that does give you the option, like if she were to purse her lips, like for example, then you might be like, okay, well she's blowing up her mouth. This is something you can do, right? All right, so let's put her back into a pose that's normal here. What else have I failed to talk about so far? Her tongue, right? So let's open up her mouth. Let's take a look at that tongue. So there's a bendy bone here. It does a dance track to the tongue controller, does a stretch to the same tongue controller. Then on the front side of her tongue, this is the other side of the bendy bone, that does a copy transformations of the tongue. That way, if I say bend the tongue, now let's pull it out of her mouth so we can see, right? So if I rotate the tip of her tongue, then that controller rotates along with it, and that way you can get that. Then because it's copying all transformations, you can also scale it up or down. Could be a little weird because you'll notice that the scale is kind of going only from basically the front half of her tongue. So the back half of her tongue isn't scaling when I scale. I haven't found much of a need for scaling the back half of her tongue, so maybe you don't care. Hopefully you don't care, but if you do, well, then you're going to have to figure that out on your own because I don't do that in mine. So then let's talk again about the mouth. So the corners and middles, as I mentioned earlier, are part of an action constraint, but also this bone in the middle between the top center and the corner, for example, it is also affected by action constraints. But one thing important to notice, let's look at one of these action constraints. One of the action constraints, the influence is only 0.4. The influence is full on all the other bones, but these in-between bones not. Why is it 0.4? Because there's also a tendency for this bone to follow towards the top of the lip and towards the corner of the lip. So these two constraints keep it basically between these two. If when this is being controlled by an action constraint, then this is being sent, say in the case of the lip top, I was to move it up, right? Well, I'm moving it up at the same time, it's pulling this in-between bone up. And if this is part of the action constraint where this was moved up and this was moved up, then this would be moved up twice. So if I actually give this one a full influence on the action constraint, it ends up doing something kind of weird. So 0.4 is what I want on just these in-between action constraints. And I think that is the full talk about the face rig. There are a couple extra things that I do. For example, if you scale up or down the eye bones, then her pupils will dilate or undilate, right? So let's just do her left eye, right? So if I scale that, her pupil goes down, up, down, up. So this is another thing that you can do. I'm not going to talk about that. It's not really part of the face rig. It's part of the eye rig, but it's something that's fun to do. This bone here, I also limit its distance to the head. This way, if I'm playing around with it, moving into some crazy locations, I always know it's going to be roughly this distance to her head. Like I'm always going to be able to find it because it's not going to fly off into space, be a long way away. You might find that you want that to be able to be moved away from her head. If so, go ahead and do that. Another thing that I do is I have a damped track on this also to the head. The purpose of the damped track here is to keep these two eyes focused like correctly. If I allowed this to rotate, I should say rotate on the Z-axis, right, then one of her eyes could be focused further off in the distance than the other one, and it'll give her a really subtle cross-eyed look. So this damped track constraint on this keeps her from going cross-eyed depending on where this is. I do let this thing rotate. I at one point was wondering if I should keep it from rotating, but I don't generally rotate it all, so it's not something that I worry about, and I guess this does give me a little extra control to have her do crazy things with her eyes, and I don't know, maybe spin around in circles, right? Woo! So they're, make up your own mind whether you want to do that. And I think that will cover everything, and as I guess I mentioned earlier about the eyebrows, I'm not going to talk about it much because I would just recommend doing something like the lips. Have a outside corners, I guess is what it's calling on the mouth. So eyebrow corner and then an eyebrow center that kind of follows in between. That would be how I would do that today. Ears, I guess I should talk about just for a second. So there's one controller that the ear is that is kind of the parent of all the ears, and then I've got it looks like a bendy bone here. I'd forgotten I do a bendy bone here, but again I would stay away from bendy bones. I'm not really happy with them. In this case, the bottom of the bendy bone, I grab it, I move around, and the bottom of her ear does that, and the top does whatever you want. And so you can get some nice elf ears if that's really what you're looking for. All right, with that I will leave you to it. Good luck making your own face rig.